This is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. We are in chapter 2. We just started chapter 2 last week, so think we are on page 52 of the translation. We're not 100% sure about that, but anyway, that's where we'll pick up today. So to recap a little bit, chapter 1 was about these different types of information machines that had been either like actually developed at the time that he was writing, or proposed or whatever. And each of these machines is capable of stimulating or reproducing certain types of behavior of humans or other animals that seem to require something like intelligence or understanding of a situation. But they are brought about in different ways in these different types of machines without anything like understanding. So in a digital computer, for example, you have just manipulating, ones and zeros. In some of these analog computers that he's describing, there's just sort of circuits of electricity that are set up in such a way as to bring about a result that, resembles or reproduces sort of intelligent behavior of an animal. And the sort of cybernetician take on these kinds of devices is that the behavior of humans and other animals that is being sort of approximated by these devices is really just sort of a more sophisticated version of what the devices themselves are doing. So if you can produce a sort of artificial tortoise like the one that he describes in chapter 1, that exhibits this sort of simple interaction of a food-seeking drive, hunger drive, and aversion to danger drive, and then like a kind of random avoiding obstacles drive. If you can sort of reproduce this very simple behavioral repertoire in this artificial device, then more sophisticated animal behavior, animals that are capable of like tracking prey across a landscape with different obstacles and so on. That's really just a more sophisticated or more complicated version of the same kind of interaction of these different feedback loops. And then ultimately, of course, the problem is that human behavior, all the things that we think of as sophisticated performances of humans, that this would also just be like a one more step or one more sort of level complication of the same kinds of processes being joined together. And Ruyer, so I think he first is just saying like empirically that this is not very plausible, that like he sort of wants to insist on the gap between the performance of these devices and the even some of the like animal behavior that they're supposed to be stimulating. That like in the case of this artificial tortoise, for example, it's only because you have the environment set up in such a way that the charging station that sort of corresponds to a food source for this artificial tortoise happens to be arranged next to a light, or in connection with a light that the device can use to orient towards the food source or the charging station. If you just like move the light to a different location away from the charging station, this artificial tortoise has no way of like determining that the correlation between light source and food source is not valid anymore. It will just keep going towards the light, even though as its battery keeps depleting. Whereas, of course, even quite simple animals, if they like are tracking something like a concentration of a chemical that is a sort of sign of a food source, and then they keep tracking it and don't find the food source, they would normally like change their behavior, learn that this is not a good guide to the food source anymore, and start using some other way of finding that food source. This kind of like flexibility, capacity to learn, adaptation to changing circumstances, and so on. All this is not really present in these devices. It's sort of an artifact of setting up the environment or the experimental setting or whatever in such a way that the very simple interaction of the 3 feedback loops in this device, results in something that looks like, quasi-intelligent or goal-directed behavior on the part of an animal. But if you just sort of change the environment slightly, this seemingly goal-directed behavior just becomes completely dysfunctional in the case of the artificial tortoise. And so, just sort of insisting on this like empirical gap between what the devices are capable of doing and what the animals that they're supposed to be simulating are actually capable of doing. And then also sort of like a kind of in principle difference in kind is like sort of the second step, that like it's not just that these computers or these devices are currently not able to reproduce empirically the performances that real animals are capable of, but also there's a sort of in principle distinction between these kinds of I guess structures of systems, or ways of operating of different systems. So there's a difference in principle between this kind of mechanical operations, and here mechanical being used in a sort of extended sense, where some of these systems are based on electronic circuits rather than gears and so on. But they're all operating in such a way that there's nowhere in the system is there anything like a grasp of meaning or significance or an understanding of anything. It's all just sort of operations that each connect to each other, one leading into the next. And it's the interaction of these different operations that produces something similar to an understanding. And then he's sort of insisting that this is never sort of equal to, this never is identical to understanding in, even in the case of animals that are understanding something in a fairly simple way, much less in the case of humans that have a detailed like theoretical understanding of a situation or even a practical understanding of a situation. So those are sort of the two levels of his objection. Is first the sort of empirical gap that these systems are not doing what the cyberneticians say they're doing, and then sort of insisting on the in principle distinction between the simulation of some kind of understanding performance and the actual understanding performance. Right, and then so in chapter 2, when we just started on, but he's sort of going into more what he has briefly mentioned in the first chapter, which is this distinction between framing activities and framed mechanisms. So he's talking about like in these systems that are sort of performing this seemingly sophisticated behavior, the behavior is always set up by a human being. So like in the case of this tortoise that I had talked about, like the setting, the environmental structure, or the way the lab is set up is something that a human has done. Has put the lights near the charging stations, for example. So there was some sort of like intention or understanding of what the goal of this experiment was, and so on, that the human had actually put to work in setting up the lab in this way. And then you have all the sort of mechanisms that bring about the behavior within this artificial tortoise. But those mechanisms are sort of surrounded or set up by the intention that the human has. And so this is sort of like what he means by this in principle distinction, is that even a fairly simple animal like a worm or something like that sort of gives itself its own goals and sets itself up, or it has this kind of autonomy that these artificial systems don't have. So the worm is not sort of given a structure by some external entity like a human experimenter. It sort of produces its own structure, sets itself its own goals of finding food, finding a mate, etc. It's sort of it frames its own sort of patterns and structures of its life, as opposed to having those patterns and structures being framed by something outside of it. And this is sort of I think the core for him of this distinction in principle between this artificial sort of mechanical system, no matter how sophisticated it is, and then a real autonomous being, even a fairly simple one like a worm, but much more so the case of a human. And so he's going to go into that more in this chapter. So that's sort of where we are now. If someone could pick up from page 52, I think we are probably at the paragraph break in most of our actions.
Yeah, I can read. I guess I'll read. I'll go over the table after I finish this paragraph. In most of our actions, we have both an quote-unquote aim assembly. Our psychophysiological apparatus is set up according to the intended aim, and a quote-unquote situation assembly. It is set up according to the current situation. For example, if there is no elevator available and the stairs are long and steep, I take a deep breath and I adopt a rhythm that would not be that of a quote-unquote 100-meter sprint. If I weigh two objects to compare their weight, it is the psychophysiological set maintained from the first to the second object, rather than the memory of the first, that allows me to make the comparison. If I do exercises to warm up, the set is very different to what it would be if I aimed for economic productivity in my movements. So there's also this table 2.1, which has 6 rows and then 4 numbered columns. And in the first column, there's some need or goal. And then in the last column, there's the kind of satisfaction state. And then the middle 2 columns are kind of mechanical action and then its effect. So probably just read like the first one. But the first one is 1, I need to feel warm. 2, I turn the thermostat up to 60 degrees. 3, the temperature of the heater rises. 4, I feel warm. And then it says all human actions without exception can be represented in an analogous way. Okay. The ready-made assembly of a device, or more precisely, the last assembly operated by the control button or lever, is the equivalent of the set. In the case of the set, organic machines are used instead of external machines. But always, even for the simplest living being, those least different from the macromolecule, there is an intervention of machines in the performance of the intended act. In a car, if I want to go faster, in brackets, I hit the gas, the engine accelerates, close brackets. My desire for speed is satisfied. In a running race, if the runner feels threatened by a rival near the finish line, his willingness to win or his fear of being beaten triggers an emotion. That is physiologically a hypersecretion of adrenaline, which accelerates muscular exertion. The will to win acts on the central nervous system, which acts on the sympathetic adrenal system, which in turn, by accumulating adrenaline in the blood, overcomes the effects of muscle fatigue. Emotion can be considered as a very general set, facilitating the passage from the will or the spiritual apprehension of a value to the more particular psychophysiological set, which, like an operation on an auxiliary machine, allows the attainment of the goal. The psychophysiological set is, of course, already impossible to reduce to a purely mechanical assembly, despite the frequent possibility of substitution. The motorist who sets himself up for the set, quote-unquote, maximum speed, makes the most diverse maneuvers according to the slopes, turns, and obstacles. It is difficult to conceive, although technological progress can achieve it asymptotically, an automaton for the driving of a vehicle such that the driver only has to press a command button, quote, maximum speed according to the circumstances, unquote, so that the machine obtains it mechanically, and that between the pure will of the driver and its realization, there would be no psychophysiological intermediary. But if the set is psychological relative to the subordinate mechanism, it is already semi-mechanical relative to will or pure intention. It works thematically, but in a semi-blind way. The proof of this lies in the absurd perseverances it often causes. A psychological quote-unquote task, once set up, continues to act, even when it no longer corresponds to an intention, like a machine that we have forgotten to turn off after we have finished using it. In most cases, instead of considering the set on the one hand and the machine on the other as interchangeable, it is better to consider them as framed within each other. This will give us the following. Figure 2.1. So the first item in figure 2.1 is number 1, I want to get there fast. 1A, psychological set, maximum speed. Number 2, operate the accelerator. Number 3, the engine accelerates. Number 3A, maximum speed is reached. And number 4, I get there fast. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there. So he's drawing this distinction between the use of some mechanical means for the achievement of a goal and even what he's calling the psychophysiological set, which is he seems to grant that this is a kind of mechanical process, but it's in some way less mechanical than the use of a machine would be, used in the place of the psychophysiological set. And the example that he gives for this of, the unlikeliness of kind of competent automatic driving machine is obviously less relevant today, but anecdotally and related to the point he's making here, I recently spoke to someone who works in AI and specifically in installing AIs in robots. And this person told me that, while you can use like a Tesla automatic cab in LA, for instance, apparently accidents involving these, automatic driving vehicles are more common than is reported. And it seems like Tesla's kind of PR strategy is to pay out very large amounts of money to people who are injured in exchange for them signing an NDA. So it's not publicized. So, even though the technology has come a long way from, 1967, I think Ruyer would not be surprised that there are still a lot of difficulties with being able to offload all of the psychophysiological set with its capacity for improvisation onto the mechanical set, which is framed by.
Yeah, that's not surprising. The Tesla thing, because I know I forget which company it was, but there was one of these companies that was advertising this, self-driving car system or whatever, but it turned out it was actually someone like remote control driving it. Like they were in like Colombia or something like that. Like at certain points, so it would be sort of like automatic, but then if the control system sort of got into a situation that it couldn't handle, it would like sort of pass off control to a remote control driver. So the person in the car doesn't really know at any point whether it's the computer system that is actually controlling the car or someone remote controlling it from a distance. It's sort of the mechanical Turk thing that like so like for those who don't know this story, but there was like this device in, I think it was the 18th century, that someone was going around touring Europe, supposedly this chess playing device, I guess it was supposed to be made with gears or whatever that would, automatically play chess. And it was like, a very skilled chess playing device. But it turned out there was actually a person hidden inside this device who was like, making all the moves and who was like an expert chess player. So this sort of mechanical device turned out to actually be a person that was controlling it, and this is sort of the same kind of thing as what's happening with some of these supposedly AI things, that like part of it is done through some sort of computer system, but then when there's like a difficult point or a point where it's uncertain and there has to be some sort of like improvisation or something like that, it sort of switches over to a person to handle those cases. So this is like in terms of like what Ruyer talks about earlier in the book. He talks about these like man in the middle kind of setups where you have like I think the one he talked about was like a targeting, like an anti-aircraft gun or something like that, where there's like certain parts of it are automatic, but then there's a person in the middle that is like watching the radar screen and pointing the gun, and then gives a command, and then there's automatic things involving the motors that turn the gun and so on. But so you have like a chain of automatic stuff coming in, the person in the middle that makes the decision, and then a chain of sort of automatic relays taking that command of the person back to the effector mechanism. And this is kind of the opposite of the types of it's kind of the opposite in relation to the framing versus framed elements of this chain compared to what he's talking about. So in the case of these man in the middle setups, you have the framing part of the chain is the mechanical part. You have the mechanical section as the input that comes in towards the person, and then you have the person is framed in the middle. The person is taking in these inputs from the mechanical system, and then the other end is the sort of mechanical output. And in these kinds of setups, this man in the middle is essentially just standing in for some kind of not yet feasible mechanical element that it's not either the technology doesn't exist for this kind of performance to be done by a machine, or maybe it's just not financially viable. Just economically, it's cheaper to have a person do it than to set up some kind of complicated machine that would do this task. But in principle, this is like a mechanical performance. The person is just sort of watching the radar screen and making a relatively simple decision. Is this a plane to shoot down or not? Whereas the kinds of setups that he's talking about are the ones where the framing part is the human element, so the human that decides to set up the in the case even of this anti-aircraft gun, someone made a decision that this is the location where we want to set up an anti-aircraft gun. We have a need for an anti-aircraft gun to shoot down enemy planes, whatever. All these sort of elements that set up the whole chain in the first place were human decisions that sort of framed the whole chain. And then presumably at some point they evaluate, is this anti-aircraft gun placement working as we wanted it to? Is it effective at shooting down enemy planes, etc.? And so the two ends of that chain are human decisions about achieving objectives and corresponding to the values and mapping onto an understanding of a situation. So there's a sort of alternation, I guess, between framing and framed, in terms of you can take any sort of chain of a situation that is framed by mechanical I guess elements at each end, where the human is framed by the framing elements that are mechanical. You can sort of embed that chain into a longer chain where a human is or some sort of human decision is framing the chain. And this is sort of what he's talking about in relation to these psychological sets. So in some sense, they are mechanical. That so an example that I don't think he mentions exactly here, but it you can think of it's a pretty close connection to what he's talking about. Is say you drive home from work following the same route every day, but then one day you say, oh, I need to stop at the grocery store on the way home. I need to get off at this exit instead of the one I usually get off at. But you're driving and you just sort of, we say, oh, I was on autopilot. You just drive past the exit where the grocery store is and you take the route that you normally take to get home. And then you only realize as you're pulling into your driveway, oh, actually I meant to stop at the grocery store, but I just didn't even think of it as I was driving. So at some point, as you're sort of getting in your car or leaving work or whatever, you sort of flick the switch in your brain to start the drive home sequence, and then just sort of followed that sequence automatically, and your intention to deviate from that sequence and go to the grocery store instead didn't operate. And so this is the kind of thing he's talking about when he says how these sort of sets can be this sort of run in this mechanical way that your sort of framing intention of deviating from your normal route and achieving a certain goal of going to the grocery store just did not get executed because you had the set of following the normal drive home route was pre-built and sort of just executed as normal. And of course there we have all kinds of preset routines that we're familiar with, making coffee in the morning or brushing your teeth or whatever, these things that you just do without even thinking about them. And these are mechanical in a certain sense, because you don't have to understand anything about brushing your teeth to sort of perform this task. But they're not mechanical in the same way as if you built a robot that, I don't know, brushed its teeth for some reason. It would have a preset sort of each brush of the toothbrush would be sort of preset at a certain angle and pressure and whatever. Whereas as a human expert toothbrusher, you can pick up a different kind of toothbrush. I don't know, if you go to the dentist and they give you here's this new experimental toothbrush that's built in a different way. You could probably figure out pretty easily that okay, I need to change the way I hold it or the pressure I apply or whatever. It might take a little bit of getting used to, but it's not like sort of that complicated a problem as opposed to with this like robot, this toothbrushing robot, it probably would just, I don't know, break the toothbrush or do something that doesn't make any sense. So this sort of psychological set is a kind of mechanism in the sense that it can run even when you don't want it to run, or when it doesn't actually achieve the goal you want. But at the same time, it has like more flexibility and ability to adapt than like a purely mechanical process like this toothbrush robot. And even in the case of like the car where you like, you know, drive past the exit where you want to get off. Obviously, when you're driving, you have to adapt to where all the other cars are. You know, if there's a pedestrian crossing the street, or you know, maybe there's one of the routes that you normally take is under construction. You have to go somewhere else, etc. Like you have to improvise to some extent, but you might do all of that and still just like drive past the exit that you wanted to get off at. So you're improvising and adapting to the situation in a certain respect, but you are still sort of like that improvisation sort of fits within the frame of like the drive home pattern that is already preset, and then you don't actually adapt that pattern to your like deviation that you wanted to take to stop at the grocery store. Yeah, and Angus has brought up here the point that we saw in the Ponce book, where he talks about like a musician can play a different instrument, or even like a simple example is like if you learn to play guitar in a standard tuning, and then you decide you want to try a different tuning, you don't have to sort of start from zero and learn everything again. You can just sort of adapt your skills in your standard tuning. It takes a little bit of adjustment, but then you sort of figure out how to play it at different tuning. So the movements are different. You like if you want to play the same scale, you have to put your fingers in different places, but you can sort of modify your set, your pattern that you've like incorporated into your habits of your finger movements and so on. You can adapt it to a different pattern rather than having to learn how to play guitar from zero again, just because the movements are different. Or even with the same tuning, like picking up a different guitar, the dimensions are going to be slightly different. The tension of the strings is slightly different, etc. So you're not performing the exact same movements with a different instrument, but because you have this like the set is more flexible than like this sort of millimeter precise movement of each finger being sort of pre-established. It's more like a sort of pattern of how to relate different finger movements to each other. And then that allows you to sort of transfer from one instrument to another one that has a sort of similar structure in terms of the tuning of the different strings to each other, and like the pattern of frets and so on. But you sort of transfer one to the other, even and you can sort of adapt to the fact that one is slightly bigger or smaller than the other, and the tension of the strings is slightly different and so on.
Are we still talking about cybernetics, or we talk about music or cybernetics in music?
We're on the cybernetics book, where we're talking about psychological sets. Like how is it that a person can sort of turn themselves into something like a machine for certain purposes, that they sort of set up a preset routine or preset pattern of behavior that usually works to perform a certain action as intended. But then if you want to deviate from that sort of normal performance, then sometimes it doesn't do what you want it to do.
In you're kind of remind me of RoboCop, right? I mean RoboCop. I think the new RoboCop. I think there's RoboCop 3, where there's a soldier, right, and he has a metal arm, right, and it's a very sophisticated, delicate metal arm, right? Like it's kind of it's all minute details, right? But he cannot coordinate between his like kind of his neurological response and his kind of hand, right? Hand movement in terms of like playing the guitar. I'm talking about the movie basically, but you're kind of saying like it reminds me of that basically, It reminds me like, okay, how can you coordinate between the neurological and kind of machinery, or how can we optimize.
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
I think in his perspective, I think that would be sort of a difference in degree more than a difference in principle. So like the sort of robot arm here in this case might be like more robotic or more mechanical, but the organic arm, the arm that the person is born with, is itself in some sense a machine. Of course, that like uh, just at the level of like a structure of an arm, and it has a bunch of levers that are being pulled by muscles and so on. And in terms of like a skilled performance like playing guitar, you like if you had to sort of deliberately think about like, oh, I'm going to move this finger in this way at with this pressure, etc. Every single time you wanted to play a note on guitar, you would never be able to like perform something like a fluid performance of a piece of music. You would just be stuck. Like each individual motion would be so like complicated that it would be impossible to actually perform anything. So you have to sort of like what you're doing when you're practicing learning how to play guitar. You practice scales and so on, and you practice the piece of music that you're trying to play. You're sort of building a kind of psychological machine or like psychomotor machine, I guess. Like you're sort of building these patterns of movement of playing a scale, playing a certain melody, etc. that can be run like semi-automatically without you having to think about like what is the exact sort of sequence of muscle contractions that I have to perform to execute this routine. And so it's essentially just a difference in degree of like how mechanical the performance is. On the one hand, of like the organic arm that sort of turns itself into a machine for the purposes of performing this complicated sequence of actions, and then this like actual sort of metal or electronic or whatever machine on the other hand, which is sort of pre-built as a machine, but the difference is just in terms of like a degree of sort of capacity for improvisation and flexibility and adaptation, as opposed to like a sort of intrinsic difference between organic machines and actual technical machines. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about these organic machines. So I'll read the next bit. I think we have a section break coming up, so we probably should have just read to there, but that's okay. Okay. In the case of organic development, we do not have the right to project ourselves empathetically in place of the organic X, or to say that the final state was the goal that this X aimed for. But the general schema is nonetheless exactly similar to that of conscious psychological action, in that there are also mechanisms, which are generally chemical, interposed between the beginning and the end of development. Some region, itself triggered, releases a hormone or an organizing substance which produces effects on some other region, effects that seem to respond to an ideal that is aimed at. In the metamorphosis of amphibians or in the puberty of mammals, thyroxine or sex hormones act on development, just as adrenaline acts on behavior in the case of emotion. The schema: 1. The organic X tends towards the adult state. 2. Release of thyroxine. 3. Action on sketched out organs. 4. Adult state. This schema is obviously metaphorical in that it speaks of a quote-unquote tendency or quote-unquote willingness at stage 1, but it is consistent with the facts in that it frames stages 2 and 3 by stages 1 and 4. For it is a fact that the quote-unquote meaningful, if not intended, transformation of the young adult has the chemical triggers as quote-unquote means. The proof lies in the fact that neighboring organizations often use very different means to achieve the same goal. There may be actions that could be called direct, that is, without means. I can judge or reason intuitively without using machines or slide rules, or even perhaps without using a psychophysiological set. In fact, it is very difficult to confirm that a psychophysiological set is not interposed. So-called quote-unquote mental calculation most probably uses some brain circuits as instruments, otherwise we would not understand why it is tiring. The practically universal case is that not only one, but several mechanical or psychophysiological functions are nested in each other, as in a Chinese box. So this sort of psychological case that we've been looking at previously, where you sort of give yourself a psychological set, or you sort of construct a kind of machine in your psychobehavioral, I guess, structure. This is for Ruyer, this is analogous to the case of development of an organism from an embryo. So he doesn't want to say exactly that an embryo is sort of directed at its adult state in the way that Aristotle might have said that, like, the acorn, has the adult oak tree as as its final cause. It's sort of development of the acorn into the oak tree is sort of governed by the adult oak tree as a final cause. But in some sense, the development of an organism is still like analogous to goal-directed behavior in a human being or another animal. So we still have this distinction between framing and framed, where you have these sort of mechanisms that are framed. So in this case, it's the release of thyroxine and the effect of that thyroxine on the embryo or the developing embryo. But these are framed by the sort of bigger picture function or whatever you want to call it, where the sequence of different chemical releases and effects of those chemicals on each other is structured in such a way as to make the embryo become the adult organism. And this is something that was like maybe around a little bit earlier than what he's writing. So like early 20th century was a big topic of debate within biology about like, is it possible to understand biology in purely mechanical terms, and especially development of an embryo in purely mechanical terms, or do we have to adopt a vitalist position according to which there's something non-mechanical that governs the development of the embryo? And one of the sort of big points or key arguments that the vitalists, the people who oppose mechanism in developmental biology, one of their key arguments was the fact that the embryo can sort of recover from different kinds of damage to some extent, obviously not any kind of damage. But for example, if you take a frog embryo and you like divide it in half at an early stage, it doesn't turn into like two half frogs, like one like head of a frog with no legs and a bunch of legs with no head. It just turns into two smaller frog embryo, tadpoles, I guess. So each of the parts of the embryo kind of, rather than being sort of preset to develop into a certain part of the tadpole, is kind of adapting to its relationship with the other parts of the embryo surrounding it, and becomes a part of the tadpole in relation to those other parts. And so if some of the parts that would normally be there are missing, then the whole sort of pattern of the embryo changes in such a way as to still bring about a more or less normal tadpole, but in this case, a smaller one. And so this was used as like an argument for the claim that this sort of tadpole organization was somehow like governing the process of development of this embryo. But of course, that sort of leaves obscure like what is this like form of the tadpole or like tadpole structure or whatever, and then how does it like act on the material of the embryo, the different chemicals and substances and so on. How does it like make them realize this pattern? And that was always sort of the counter argument, is that you haven't really explained anything just by saying, oh, there's a tadpole form that has to be realized, because you still have to like explain how this tadpole form actually affects the embryo as this physical portion of matter that exists in a certain place and time. So this was sort of like the debate in the early 20th century. And so he's like obviously more sympathetic to the vitalist position here, but he, I think, wants to be a little bit more careful in that he's not saying that there's something like this form that sort of acts on the developing embryo. I think what he's more, a more careful expression of what he's trying to say here is that the structure of all the different interactions of the chemicals and portions of the embryo is set up in such a way as to bring about the development of a tadpole. And so it's something about like the way all these different chemicals interact with each other that sort of implements the form of the tadpole, as opposed to like a tadpole form being kind of imposed on the embryo matter. And that's, I think, what he means here by this like framing operation. Is so it's not that there's a demiurge that is contemplating the form of the tadpole and then assembling the chemicals into the proper configuration to copy that form. It's instead something about the way that these chemicals interact with each other, the way that the embryo is configured, and so on, that results in the development of the tadpole, and it's precisely that configuration of the different chemicals that make up the embryo that is the sort of tadpole directedness of the embryo. So it's hard to like, I guess, express this in a way that doesn't suggest that there's like a little image of the adult tadpole or the juvenile tadpole that is like inside the embryo that just needs to be like sort of filled in with actual chemicals and tissues and so on. But I think that he wants to sort of understand this apparent goal directedness, or this analogy between goal directed behavior and biological development, without sort of supposing that there is like the sort of that there's like an image of the goal state within the embryo, or like governing the development of the embryo. Yeah, I mean, and this obviously has changed. The sort of configuration of this problem has changed a lot in since the time when Ruyer is writing. So we of course have a whole sort of discipline of molecular biology that didn't really exist at the time he was writing, or was just starting to be developed. And the whole like the role of DNA in the process of the development of an embryo is something that was not really known at that time, and is obviously an important part of the story. But I think the same sort of problem is still, like, you can still sort of set out the same problem, but obviously in terms of different exact sort of mechanisms and so on. And this is like something I think we talked about a little bit in a previous meeting, that like what exactly is a function in biology. That like it's pretty much impossible to talk about biology, to study organisms, without talking about the functions of different organs and hormones and whatever in an organism. But at the same time, our sort of default understanding of a function is in terms of an intention. That like in a machine, for example, you have like this component has the function of keeping the engine from overheating. That means that someone decided, I don't want this engine to overheat, so I'm going to put a component that prevents that from happening. Whereas obviously, in the case of biological organisms, there is not this sort of demiurge that is adding components or hormones or whatever to this organism to perform a function with a deliberate goal. So yeah, how do we understand a function of a biological organism without sort of kind of tacitly understanding it as a goal that is being imposed on the organism? Yeah, and actually, yeah. So Bats has mentioned something here about DNA in the chat, about like how the sort of like I guess popular depiction of DNA is like, you often hear DNA described as like the blueprint of life or something like that. And I think people sort of picture that like the DNA has like a little set of instructions that like make an arm, make a leg, make a kidney, etc. But that is really not what DNA is like at all. That like essentially DNA is just like a template for proteins. And like one of the sort of important facts about DNA that sort of undermines this sort of blueprint picture is the fact that every cell in your body more or less has the same DNA. But of course you have hundreds of different cell types. You have blood cells, neurons, muscle cells, etc. So each of these cells has the same DNA, but different proteins are being produced in these cells using the DNA as a template. So you have what's known as gene expression, so that in certain cells, certain portions of the genome are being transcribed into proteins, and then in other cells you have other portions that are being used for proteins. And then the whole like network of chemicals that determines that in this cell these kinds of proteins are going to be produced, whereas in this other cell these other proteins are going to be produced. That is not itself sort of in the DNA. It's this interaction of all these different chemicals with each other that determines which proteins are going to be produced using that DNA in each cell. So yeah, the sort of blueprint conception is like a sort of like it's almost a sort of reproduction of this Aristotelian picture of like the the oak tree is like this adult oak tree is the final cause that brings about the development of the embryo into the oak tree. You just sort of translate that into this like more modern terminology of like the DNA is the blueprint that that the oak trees or that the acorn's development follows to become the oak tree, and that sort of like hides the actual interaction of the different chemicals and gene expression networks and so on that actually bring about the development of the acorn into an oak tree in this much more complicated way. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. Bats, do you want to read from Science in the Frame? You can read the whole section because it's just like a page and a half, I think.
Yeah, we start with Science and the Frame, right?
Yes. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Science is much more at ease in explaining the mechanical or semi-mechanical median region of actions than in understanding their origin and end. Doctrines such as existentialism, psychological conceptions that address the I, quote, such as those of William Stern or Mary W. Calkins, and biological or psychological vitalist theories are hardly welcome. The same is true for Platonic or Husserlian philosophies of essence, for axiology, or for the theory of organic types. In short, science neglects everything that is quote-unquote framing, whether it is the quote-unquote agent or the quote-unquote ideal. When there are several nested quote-unquote means, for example, when the operation of an auxiliary device is itself nested in the half-operating action of the psychological set, this open quote, law of negligence quote, is even more striking. The more central the means, the clearer and more scientifically accessible they are. There is nothing clearer than the operation of a thermostat, an elevator, a directional gyro sperry, or a slide rule. The operation of a physiological set is already more difficult to understand. Even more difficult is the action of a psychological quote-unquote task. The psychologists at the Würzburg School, like the psychoanalysts, have been accused of pseudoscience. Finally, the action of nature of the will, of the quote-unquote I or of the organic X, the intentional relationship of the quote-unquote I to an ideal, is quite mysterious. So we understand that science has always tried to interpret the framing elements, 1 and 4, starting from the framed elements, 2 and 3, the encompassing action starting from the auxiliary functioning encompassed. Cybernetics is only the latest, most precise, and most interesting attempt to reduce the whole quote-unquote framing to auxiliary functioning. And yet, only instinctive or voluntary motivations give meaning and possibility to auxiliary assemblies. Isolated assemblies make no sense and are literally nothing. The automata of cybernetics, having no motivation, are not beings. Gray-Walter's automata are pure passages from stimulus to response, while real beings go towards their goal by way of means and obstacles. Automata actually operate according to a framing will, that of their constructor. They are auxiliary machines for the constructor, like all man-made machines, and it is absurd to use the auxiliary as a model to understand the autonomous being. The mechanical causal sequence from 2 to 3, and the causal and thematic sequence of the psychological set, which is at the same time a open quote, push at ergo, and an quote-unquote orientation towards an optimum, from 1A to 3A, imply the finalist action 1 to 4. The mechanical sequence is without consciousness. The action of the psychological set is subconscious, but the whole is set up by an intentional consciousness. In the experiments with Dr. Ashby's homeostat, the set is represented by the various adjustments of the assemblies. Dr. Ashby makes a mistake of vocabulary or designation on this subject that appears unimportant but which is of great consequence for philosophical interpretation. He considers the interventions of the experimenter as representing the open quotes, modification of the environment, in quotes, and the rest of the apparatus as representing the brain that has to adapt to these modifications. This is a serious confusion. The environment and its changes often impose a quote-unquote task on us. For example, the lowering of the temperature imposes on us the task of raising the thermostat's thermometer. But it is the living being himself who must, open quotes, rise to the task, end quotes, in order to respond to the change. The brain is therefore represented by the entire homeostat, including various assemblies, and not only by the part of the apparatus that responds to the constraints that the experimenter imposes on the other part. Consciousness is represented by the intervening experimenter, which means that it is not explained at all by the apparatus. It is precisely the action of taking on the task imposed by the environment. Taking on a task through a set is not the same as being subjected to it.
Thanks. Yeah, there's actually brings to mind something from the book that we were talking about before we started recording. This is Peter Godfrey Books. Blanking on his name now. Peter Godfrey Smith's book, Other Minds, which is about what we can learn about the nature of mind from looking at cephalopods like the octopus and squids and cuttlefish, which have a very different kind of psychological organization than humans and other mammals do, but are also very intelligent. And in that book, he talks about how, or some accounts of consciousness, which see consciousness as having to do essentially with novelty, like adaptation to a novel situation. Whereas all kinds of other, like in our brains, in the organization of the human brain, for example, we have all kinds of quasi-mechanical operations going on that we are not even aware of. Like in our visual system, we have like edge detectors, for example, that there are certain neurons that are especially sensitive to the presence of an edge in a portion of the visual field. Like if you have a dark line on a light background, for example, and so it depends on the location of this line and the orientation, whether it's vertical or horizontal or at a certain angle. So we have all these edge detectors. Of course, we're not like aware, oh, my edge detector 7 is firing or whatever. We just sort of see the scene around us, including the edges of objects, and the objects kind of stand out from the background. But part of how that happens, how the object stands out from the background, is through the functioning of these edge detectors. And then you can think of maybe more sophisticated or more complicated kinds of performances, like catching a ball that someone is throwing. This involves a pretty complicated sort of process of like tracking the trajectory of the ball and predicting where it's going to be, and then moving your feet and to put you in the right place to catch the ball, and moving your hands in such a way as to be where the ball is going to be and grasp the ball at the right time, etc. This is all very complicated, but you don't have to calculate. You don't have to pull out a calculator and enter in the differential equations for the motion of the ball and the how you have to move your feet to get to the right location and so on. You just sort of do it, you just respond to where the ball is moving and where you go. So all these things are happening kind of automatically in our brains without our awareness. But if you are writing an essay or drawing a picture or whatever, you're doing something that is not this sort of automatic process. You have to sort of figure out what it is you're trying to do and how you want to do it. That's where you have this conscious awareness of what you're doing, where you have here's my goal, here's the set of tools that I have to try to achieve that goal. How do I use these tools to reach that goal that I'm trying to achieve? Even something maybe more less sort of sophisticated or less intense maybe, but you want to cook dinner and you just sort of look in your fridge, oh, what do I have on hand? And you try to figure out how to use those ingredients in a way to produce something that actually tastes good. It involves a certain amount of improvisation and sort of novelty and flexibility. And so you probably will think does this ingredient work with this other ingredient? No, that would be gross. I don't want to mix these two things together. You're sort of aware of what you are doing in a way that you are not aware when you're catching the ball. And so this is I think related to what he's talking about here, where the sort of mechanical or quasi-mechanical sets or psychological processes that he's describing as the framed portions of the chain. So in the case of the ball, for example, you might have the sort of framing intention at the very outset is like, I want to win this game. You're playing baseball or something. I want to win the game. And that, of course, has like sub goals that, like, if I want to win the game, I should try to catch this ball. But then, from that sort of intention of catching the ball, there's this sort of quasi-mechanical process that you have no real awareness of, that sort of directs your body in such a way as to make it possible to catch the ball. And then if that process works the way you wanted it to, then you achieve the goal of catching the ball, and maybe that allows you to win the game. And so you have like the sort of outside of the chain, the two ends of the chain are like the intention to win the game and the result of winning the game. But the sort of inner portion of the chain involves this quasi-mechanical process of, adapting your body to the trajectory of the ball, which you are not aware of. And so, yeah, this like role of consciousness as the framing portion of the chain is something that he's like insisting on here, even in the case of these devices that the cyberneticians are talking about, as if they were reproducing the whole chain. He's sort of insisting on the fact that the framing is still always the conscious human being. There's like the experimenter that is like putting these circuits together in a way that produces this device, and setting up the environment so that the charging station of the artificial tortoise has a light on top of it, for example. All of this is done by the experimenter, who is a conscious human being and has like intentions and goals and certain ideals for what it is to do a good scientific experiment and so on. All of this is done by a conscious human being, even if a lot of the inner portions are being done by setting up vacuum tubes and wires and so on that are not at all responsive to an understanding of a situation. They're just operating by the flow of electricity through a circuit. And what he's sort of, I think what he's saying here essentially is that there's this kind of fallacy from saying that, oh, we have modeled the inner portion of this chain in terms of this mechanical system. Therefore, the outer ends of this chain, the 1 and 4 that he's talking about, are also just purely mechanical. And he says you can't actually sort of infer from the possibility of reproducing the inner portions of the chain mechanically to the possibility of eliminating the role of consciousness at the ends of the chain. This is a kind of fallacy to make that inference. Yeah, and so Angus has put in the chat here that you can sort of connect this with Simondon's discussion of like the social basis for hylomorphism as a theory of the nature of an entity. And he talks about how you can sort of imagine that this theory comes from the slave owner who buys a bunch of clay and tells his slaves make some bricks. So he has like in his mind he has the brick form and the clay matter, and he doesn't really know anything or care at all about like how the slave actually goes about connecting these 2 points of the chain together. So yeah, you have like the 1 and 4 in this case are the brick form and the clay matter, and the middle portion of the chain is like sort of is kind of outsourced to the slaves, who have to actually implement the sort of interaction of this sort of abstract form and the physical matter. And so likewise in the case of these devices that the cyberneticians are putting together, you have like some sort of image of like animal behavior, or this like depiction of animal behavior, and you have like, I don't know, a box, a drawer full of like wires and vacuum tubes and so on, and you have to figure out how to put them together in such a way that like the circuits that you design will implement this form of animal behavior, but it's still you as the conscious human being who like actually makes the connections in such a way that the circuits of this artificial tortoise produce something that resembles animal behavior, even if the sort of inner portion of that circuit is inner portion of the chain is implemented in this purely electronic way with just wires connected to each other in a particular way, and doesn't like you've managed to reproduce the inner portion of the chain in such a way that you are not relying on anything resembling understanding of a situation But that doesn't mean that you have like eliminated understanding altogether, because the outside of the chain still involves this understanding that you as a conscious human being have of, what it is for an animal to do something that resembles goal-directed behavior, or what it is to do a good experiment, and so on. Like all these things are sort of presupposed by the fact that you even built this machine in the first place.
Yeah, this is a really interesting section. The point that scientific inquiry tends to focus on steps 2 and 3, or like that the kind of innermost framed elements tend to be the easiest elements to explain, kind of makes me think of at the beginning of this book we talked about different ways of like framing the problem of consciousness in philosophy, and the way Ruyer talks about these as relatively simpler and relatively more difficult problems. I wonder if we could say that Ruyer's statement of like the so-called hard problem of consciousness would be he would make it in terms of this framing and framed structure, so that the easy problems, which are of course not actually easy, of kind of understanding the mechanisms that underlie consciousness, would, even if they are solved, not necessarily tell us anything about the kind of the movement from 1 to 2, and then the relationship between 1 and 4 and 2 and 3.
Yeah, I think like when we talk about like the hard problem of consciousness, usually like the focus is on like the so-called qualia, that like, what is it about a certain activation of certain neurons that like brings about the feeling of like, or the sensation of a red color. Like there seems to be this sort of disjunction or this gap between like certain neurons are firing and there is like this red sensation. Of course, there's nothing red inside your brain when these neurons are firing. And I think, I suspect that we would see this as like not really the important problem of like about consciousness. Like this is kind of a side track, I think, for him, that like what we want, what's interesting about consciousness, what we want to, what's important, and why we care about like consciousness is precisely this function of framing that consciousness has in our lives, that will like it's the capacity to like not just sort of execute certain tasks, like even like you can think of color perception as a kind of task in a very simple sense, that like distinguishing a red fruit from a green fruit, for example, can be important in determining whether that fruit is actually edible or not. So you have this like color discrimination task. This is like a fairly simple and kind of a framed portion of our mental life. But then the role of consciousness for Ruyer would be like, deciding, is it good to eat red fruits or not? Like maybe there's a reason why I don't want to eat red fruits. I don't know, I could decide that maybe this kind of fruit is like ecologically damaging, and so I shouldn't eat the red fruit because that's like contributing to ecological destruction, or maybe I have a religious reason for not eating this kind of fruit or whatever. You can like, the role of consciousness comes in when you are evaluating like not just sort of the whether this goal is being achieved or not, which is like something that can happen without consciousness, like in the case of the catching a baseball. But you're deciding, is this goal something I want to pursue at all? Do I want to win this baseball game? Do I want to play baseball at all, etc.? So yeah, I think for him, this like focus on qualia and like, what is it that makes certain patterns of neural activation sort of correspond to sensations of certain kinds. I think he would see that as kind of not that interesting, and I think he would see the more interesting question as being like, what is the relationship between this like framing role of consciousness as determining the values and the sort of overall configuration of our actions, and the sort of mechanisms that we set up in our in our brains, in our psychological life, that implement those actions in sometimes very, but still always as like framed by the broader like intentions of or the orientations towards certain ideals or values that sort of are what he's talking about when he talks about consciousness.
This is maybe a bit of an aside, but I just wanted to note something that I've been thinking about while we're reading this. Kind of relates to the point about the hard problem of consciousness, but it seems like philosophers like Ruyer and Bergson and Merleau-Ponty seem much more willing than philosophers in like the phenomenological or like existentialist tradition to grant that even though Bergson, Ruyer, and Merleau-Ponty all want to draw some difference in kind between mechanism and life or consciousness or memory, they seem to be perfectly willing to grant that many of our like psychological and bodily actions are explicable in mechanistic terms, where it would be difficult to see I don't know, like Heidegger making the same concession, I guess. This something we've mentioned a couple of times in these groups, but something I like about this tradition is that kind of accounting for both like the successive scientific explanation of these processes, but at the same time drawing philosophical conclusions from scientific data.
Yeah, so certainly Heidegger would never sort of allow that like Dasein's operation with even the hammer sort of tool use stuff would be explicable in terms of mechanical operations. I think he even makes a sort of dismissive remark in Being and Time about like biological approaches to anthropology or something like that. I can't remember exactly what he says, but the idea of like even sort of allowing there to be any relevance of like the sort of mechanical stuff, the biological machines that make up the body of a human being, that there would be any relevance of that to the nature of Dasein, the nature of a human being's capacity to orient itself in the world and understand itself and so on. He would completely reject that whole sort of approach. And of course, he's like pretty hostile to natural science in general throughout his career, and I think like increasingly so over time. And so of course there's like I think that there's like a lot of limitations to that approach, where like if you just sort of like dismiss a whole sort of section of like human understanding of the world and of ourselves as like not relevant to the like true or authentic way of understanding ourselves, then you are kind of limiting what you like the basis for your way of understanding human existence and the world around us and so on. That like if you just say, oh, I'm not going to look at science at all, I'm going to just dismiss science altogether, then you are sort of like cutting yourself off from like one of the like even at like an anthropological level, like the nature of Dasein in 20th, 21st century the world like is completely structured by science and technology in ways that I think go beyond the very sort of general superficial stuff that Heidegger says about either of those topics. And to not examine that in a careful way, I think is like just sort of missing a lot of really important stuff. Of course, the sort of flip side of that is that like you don't want to sort of uncritically just accept whatever is sort of presented as the scientific explanation of human behavior, of human mental life, of the nature of the world, etc. You have to examine the arguments and the what are the presuppositions that are being made in presenting these positions and so on in a critical way. That you have to say, okay, how is this argument actually does it actually show what the people presenting it are claiming that it shows? And often you find that you have to make a lot of like extra presuppositions that are not mentioned explicitly to sort of get that argument to work. And then you can sort of raise questions about whether those are actually good presuppositions to make and so on. And so that's, I think, what what a lot of what we've, these authors that we've been reading, Simondon, Merleau-Ponty, Ruyer have all been doing is like, looking carefully at, arguments that scientists make about like, the way that human mental life works, for example, and then trying to find these like hidden presuppositions and, looking at like, is this actually a presupposition that we can really, that really holds up to scrutiny if we make it explicit and actually study it for, as a sort of general principle of the way that human mental life works. And often when you do that, you find that these presuppositions are a lot less, I guess, viable than maybe it seems when you only look at sort of the results of the like experimental study and not like the more, I guess, thorough examination of the presuppositions that are behind that experimental study. Okay, so we're getting up to the 2-hour mark, and we're at a section break, so I'm going to suggest we stop here for today. That works for everyone?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
So in terms of schedule, I think I should be fine to meet next. I know we're sort of over the Christmas break, so I think next Sunday should be fine for me if everyone else is good with that to meet as usual. But if other people are like away or whatever, we can also look at doing a different time. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So let's stick with this time then, and we can meet as normal